I always believed that the past fades on its own, gently, like old film losing color. What I didn't know was that sometimes it waits for you instead quietly, patiently, until you step into the exact moment it needs you the most. And then it unravels. My name is, well, it doesn't matter for the story. What matters is the version of me that existed not long ago. A tired man, withdrawn without meaning to be, and permanently anchored to nostalgia, as if it were the only part of myself that felt honest anymore. I'm 5'10", a silhouette of someone who has carried too many long nights and not enough mornings. My voice, steady yet dim, is the voice of someone who tends to speak more to himself than to others. The story begins on a Sunday, the kind of day that feels hollow no matter how you try to fill it. I had come back to my childhood home, not because I wanted to, but because empty houses eventually demand your attention. My mother had moved into assisted living 6 months earlier, and the old place sat untouched, drowning in dust motes and half-forgotten scents. I wasn't there to dig into the past. I told myself I was just sorting things, packing, letting go. But I suppose that's the biggest lie we tell ourselves, that we can touch old memories without waking them. I stepped into the living room, the one room that always felt colder than it should. A CRT television stood in the corner, square and silent, like it had been waiting for someone to turn it on again. Beside it was a shelf with old VHS tapes, most of them labeled in my mother's careful handwriting. Christmas 1996, school play, family trip. Each one a capsule of a life I once lived but didn't revisit. I wasn't planning to go through any of them. Not then. Not yet. I went upstairs to what used to be my room. Nothing much had changed except the air. It smelled older. My childhood desk sat by the window, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the dust on it was new or the same dust I never bothered to clean as a kid. I opened the drawers methodically, almost mechanically, sorting old notebooks, broken pencils, a couple of cassette cases with no tapes inside. And then in the back of the lowest drawer, I touched something that felt out of place, a small cardboard box, plain, unlabeled, taped closed. At first glance, it didn't look like anything significant, but my fingers hesitated on the edges, and a faint something stirred inside me. Recognition or dread? I'm still not sure. I carried it downstairs to the living room. The floorboards groaned in a way that reminded me how long it had been since anyone walked with purpose here. Sunlight through the window cut a warm slice across the room, catching floating dust in a way that made everything feel suspended in time. I sat on the carpet in front of the CRT TV, set the box beside me, and stared at it for a moment longer than needed. There's something strange about opening a box you don't remember sealing. The tape peeled away with a soft tear. Inside were 3 items: a small microcassette, the kind used in handheld recorders, a folded note, one unlabeled VHS. Taped my hands stayed on the edges of the box. For some reason, I didn't want to touch anything inside yet. A chill nudged its way along my spine, not fear, not quite, but something colder than nostalgia and heavier than curiosity. Eventually, I took the note. The paper crackled softly. My mother's handwriting, neat, careful, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It said only one sentence: You should listen before you watch. That was it. No explanation. No signature dot, just a simple instruction, as if she knew I'd eventually find this. As if she had been waiting for this exact moment. I unfolded the rest, hoping for something more, but it was blank. I set the note down and picked up the microcassette. It was lighter than I expected. There was no label on it either, only faint scratches that might have been accidental or deliberate. I turned it over slowly as if inspecting something fragile. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if this isn't meant for me? But the note said otherwise. I didn't have a recorder anymore. I hadn't seen one in decades. But I knew my mother had kept an old dictaphone in the study. She used it for grocery lists when their memory began to play tricks on her, just before the doctors gently called it what it was, early cognitive decline. I found the device in a drawer, exactly where I last saw it. I wiped the dust off with my sleeve, inserted the microcassette, and sat back down in front of the TV. I hesitated before pressing play. My thumb hovered over the button. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a moment that would pull something loose inside me. Something tightly sealed for years. I pressed it. Static first. A hollow hiss. Then a sound I didn't expect. My own voice. A child's voice. Thin. Soft. Breathing unevenly, as if nervous or hiding. Mom, are you there? My heart thudded once hard. I leaned closer to the recorder, the beam of sunlight cutting through the dust and warming the side of my face. The breath of my younger self crackled through the tiny speaker. I don't want to go downstairs again. Another pause, a shaky inhale. I heard him last night. I froze. Who? Who did I mean? My father hadn't lived with us since I was 5. He wasn't violent. He wasn't threatening. He just left quietly, the kind of absence that doesn't echo but still changes the shape of the room. So who was him? The tape continued. Mom, please don't make me sleep alone. The child in the recording sounded scared, but of what? Of whom? I forced myself to breathe. The air in the room had thickened suddenly, as if the walls were absorbing the sound, more static. A click. At a different moment on the tape, I heard the sound of footsteps, tiny ones, and then a whisper. I saw the light under the door again. The door? Which door? For a moment I thought maybe I recorded this during some childhood nightmare. Kids imagine things. I certainly did. Shadows became people. Floorboards became signals. Nighttime was full of shapes we couldn't explain, but then the child may said something that made the hairs on my arms rise. Mom, why don't you remember? Silence. Then the tape clicked off. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until the room seemed to exhale with me. I pulled the microcassette out, set the recorder aside, and stared at the VHS tape still lying in the box. The note's words pressed into my thoughts, like a whisper behind my ear. You should listen before you watch. What was I supposed to watch? My hand moved toward the VHS tape reluctantly. It had no label, and the plastic looked slightly discolored, aged, but not ruined. I turned it over and noticed something scratched faintly on the bottom. Edge. Not a word, just a number, 3, no context. No other tapes marked like it, just the number 3. My throat tightened. The air in the house suddenly felt too still, like everything was waiting for me to make the next move. I slid the tape into the VHS player beneath the CRT. The machine whirred to life, coughing dust into the air. I sat back, remote in hand, thumb hovering over the play button. But I didn't press it. Not yet. I found myself suddenly aware of the room. The soft hum of electricity when I plugged in the TV, the golden rectangle of sunlight stretching across the floor, the motes of dust rising then falling. It felt like being inside a memory rather than a house. And then, unexpectedly, a thought surfaced. Why was I talking to my mother on that tape? And why did I think she didn't remember something? I rubbed my temples, feeling a faint ache forming. Memories from childhood are slippery. They shift when you try to hold them, but this felt like something intentionally forgotten. I lifted the remote again, paused, listened to the silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, I pressed play. The screen flickered. A wash of static, a faint rumble, like something trying to pull itself into clarity. The picture struggled, lines bending, shapes forming, but not quite. A dim room appeared dark, unfamiliar, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. Not our living room. Not any room I recognized. The angle was low, like the camera had been placed on the floor. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then, in the far right corner of the frame, a shape shifted, a silhouette, small, child, sized, sitting, motionless, my breath caught. The static deepened, and a faint voice, my voice as a child, began to speak, barely audible through the distortion. I don't want to go back down there. The same words from the microcassette, but this time I could see the room and the silhouette and something else, a soft glow of light coming from outside the frame. A door, maybe a hallway, a place I had apparently been afraid of. The recording wavered, moments, stretched. My younger self lifted his head slowly, as if listening to something just outside the view. Then the screen cut abruptly to black. Not the end, not a fade, a sudden, jarring stop. I stared at the blank screen, my heart beating heavier than before. Whatever this tape was, whatever 3 meant, whatever my mother expected me to understand, I didn't touch the remote for a long time after the screen went black. The silence felt different, now thicker, as if the house had inhaled and was waiting for me to do the same. Somewhere outside, a car passed by, but even that sound seemed distant, muffled, irrelevant. A door, but not one from this house. The moment the screen cut to black again, I paused the tape and sat back. The carpet under me felt colder, though I couldn't tell whether the air had changed or if it was only my body responding to something old, awakening. I rubbed my palms together. I wasn't shaking, but I felt close to it. There was a reason my mother left that note. There was a reason this tape was hidden. There was a reason I didn't remember recording that microcassette. But most unsettling of all, there was a reason I didn't recognize the room on the VHS at all. I took a slow breath and finally stood up. My legs were a little stiff from sitting too long on the floor, or maybe from tension. I walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The house carried echoes of past routines, my mother humming, drawers opening, the clink of dishes. None of those sounds were here now, yet somehow they lingered, as if the walls hadn't gotten used to the quiet. I drank half the glass before I realized my hand was gripping it too tightly. I set it down and returned to the living room. The TV screen reflected my silhouette in the dim light, distorted slightly by the static still present on the paused frame. For a brief moment, the reflection looked younger than me, shorter, narrower shoulders. I blinked, and the illusion broke. Just me again. I turned off the TV. I needed a moment without the noise, standing in the sudden stillness. I took the micro cassette from the table. I turned it over in my fingers. There was something about the way my childhood voice said, "Why don't you remember?" A question directed to my mother, not to me, that felt wrong. Children don't question adults' memory like that. Not unless something has been dismissed, or denied. I sat back down with the dictaphone. Maybe there was more on the tape I missed. I pressed rewind, clicked play. Static. A hum. Then Mom. He was there again. That wasn't on the first playback, or maybe I was too startled to notice. My younger self spoke quietly, like someone trying not to be overheard. "I don't want to sleep in the small room anymore." Small room? I thought about my childhood home. There was my bedroom, my mother's room, a guest room. None of them were small. None of them matched the dark little space shown in the VHS. My breath slowed. I saw the light under the door. The child me whispered again. "But you said no one is there." I felt a chill slide beneath my skin. More static. A faint squeal. Then another fragment. "Why don't you hear him too?" I stopped the tape. My chest tightened. Hear him? Who? There was no him in our house when I was a child. No tenant, no relatives, no visits from anyone who stayed overnight. My father lived 2 states away and rarely called. The house had always been just my mother and me, unless... No, that made no sense. I exhaled slowly, focusing on the familiar objects around the room. A wooden bookshelf, the old lamp with its crooked shade, the framed picture of me in 3rd grade still sitting on a side table as though waiting for someone to dust it. Everything grounded me, but not enough to calm the unease twisting its way through memory. My mind drifted back to the tape. Again. To the silhouette. To the faint glow. That glow. It wasn't warm like a lamp. It wasn't the flicker of a candle. It had a colder sheen, almost bluish. Even through the sepia haze of the VHS, I needed to see the tape again. I needed to understand, but before that I needed to look around the house. I stood and walked to the hallway, turning slowly, scanning the walls, the doors. They all felt familiar in the way childhood places do, even after decades. The slight scratch on the molding near the bathroom door, the spot on the wall where a picture once hung, the hallway light switch that always stuck halfway. But nothing resembled the room in the footage. Nothing. Yet. My younger self spoke as though it was a room I lived with, a room I feared. I walked back upstairs, letting instinct guide me rather than logic. My footsteps echoed softly. This house wasn't large, but empty walls make even normal sound feel distant. I checked the guest room first. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mother's room next. Still neat, untouched, smelling faintly of lavender. Then I stood before the door to my old childhood bedroom. A memory nudged me, not clear, not solid, more like an emotion brushing the back of my mind, something cold, something I didn't want to name. I opened the door. The room wasn't small. It wasn't dark. It wasn't the room from the tape. It was simply my room, familiar, ordinary, except as I stepped inside, my eyes drifted to the far left wall where the old wardrobe stood, and something clicked in my mind, subtle but sharp. A wardrobe, a piece of furniture I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered storing board games in it, old clothes, the broken robot toy I refused to throw away. I remembered the way it creaked when opened too fast, but that wasn't the memory that stopped me cold. The memory that surfaced was this. There used to be something behind that wardrobe, No, not something. Door, my pulse picked up. A door I hadn't thought about since childhood. Door my mother told me not to open. A door I convinced myself didn't exist. I walked slowly across the room. The floorboards creaked beneath me, not in the dramatic way old houses usually do, but softly, reluctantly, as if they weren't ready for someone to step here again. I stopped in front of the wardrobe. It looked normal. Just a tall wooden cabinet with a slightly faded handle. But now the shape of it, the angle, the way it sat, away from the wall by an inch more than it should, it all started to feel wrong. Touched the right side panel. Wood. Cool. But not cool from temperature cool like the air behind it wasn't. The same as the air in the room. My breath caught. I gripped the front edge and pulled. The wardrobe resisted at first. Years of inertia held it in place. But then it shifted with a scraping sound that felt too loud. Too sharp. Dust rose in a small cloud. I pulled harder. The wardrobe slid aside just enough for me to see it. A door, small, barely half the height of a normal one. Faded white paint. Chipped in the corners, a single metal handle. Door that had no business being here. A door I had forgotten. A door that matched the size and shape of the one in the VHS tape. I felt something tight and deep in my chest. A pressure, a truth trying to surface. Crouched down slowly, examining it. The wood was old but intact. I touched the handle. It was colder than it should have been, colder than anything else in the room. My mind raced. Why was this door hidden? Why did I forget it existed? Why did the child me on the tape fear it? I swallowed, backing up slightly. Something told me not to open it. Something equally strong told me I had already opened it once before. But before I could make a decision, a sound drifted from downstairs, a faint click, light, subtle, metallic. The VHS player. Turning itself back on, I straightened abruptly. Heart pounding, I took a step toward the hallway, then froze. Another sound, a soft hum. Then my childhood voice, faint, distant, echoing through the floorboards. Don't go back down there. The same sentence from the tape, only this time. I wasn't imagining it. It was happening now. In this house. In this moment. I backed up a step, pulse throbbing in my ears. The door behind the wardrobe seemed to draw the room inward. As if the air around it tightened, I had two choices. Go downstairs to the voice, to the VHS now playing. itself to the thing waiting in the static or stay here with the door I once feared. Door my mother made me forget, the door connected to a room I never should have entered. Either way, the past had awakened Dot, and it wasn't going back to sleep. I took one slow breath, and I chose. I stood frozen in the doorway of my old room, the faint echo of my childhood voice still lingering in the air, not supernatural, not impossible, but undeniably real in the way memories sometimes replay themselves when you're standing in the exact place they were formed. Dot, it wasn't the VHS player speaking. Dot, it wasn't the house. Dot, it was my mind, stirred, cracked open, letting something old leak upward. A buried memory pressing against the present. I stepped back from the hidden door behind the wardrobe. My pulse slowed, not from calm, but from a strange clarity washing over me. Something inside me recognized this small door, not visually, but emotionally, like the echo of a feeling I once had but refused to name. Downstairs, the VHS player hummed again, soft, rhythmic, not self-activating. It was simply stuck mid-rewind from when I pressed the button earlier. The house was old. Appliances made sounds. My childhood voice wasn't in the air, it was in me. I repeated that thought deliberately. Nothing supernatural is happening. This is memory resurfacing because I'm finally facing it. I exhaled, the quiet settled around me, then I crouched again in front of the small door. This time I let myself look at it without fear, or at least with a fear I could name. A familiar fear, childhood fear. I placed my palm flat against the wood, cold, but not unnatural. Cold, because this part of the house wasn't insulated well. Cold, because no one had opened this door in decades. Cold, because I had avoided this exact memory for so long that even touching it now felt like uncovering the lid of a sealed box inside my own mind. As I held my hand there, a faint sensation rippled through me, not a vision, not a sound, but a sense of space, of being smaller, kneeling, closer to the floor, hearing muffled voices through wood. A sensation I instantly recognized but couldn't yet assemble into words. I lowered my hand, stood, and backed away. The truth wasn't behind this door, not physically, The truth was in why this door existed in my memory at all. I went back downstairs. The house seemed quieter now that I had stopped projecting childhood fear onto every small sound. The VHS player had stopped humming. The static had faded from the screen. I sat on the carpet again and looked at the TV, not at the fear, but at the details I missed earlier. I rewound the tape and pressed play. Static. Warm sepia tones, dust flickering in the beam of a lamp. The small room, the silhouette of a child sitting on the floor. This time, I didn't focus on the child, I focused on the walls. The room wasn't unfamiliarly small. It wasn't somewhere else. It was simply shot at an angle that distorted perspective, and the lighting made it appear narrower. The corners looked warped because of the old camera lens. And the glow under the door? Not a glow, not something unknown, just a hallway light. The kind my mother used to leave on for me when I was scared. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Just a recording of a scared child in a dark room with a door slightly open. A room I suddenly recognized. More clearly now. My mother's sewing room. Before it was a sewing room. Before she moved her machine into it. Before she filled it with fabric and half-finished projects. It had been something else. A small room. A room I slept. And for a short period, a room she later pretended had never served that purpose. I paused the tape so abruptly that the frame froze with a slight warping of the child's silhouette. My breath slowed as puzzle pieces began shifting into place. I remembered something. Not an image, not a scene, a feeling. I was maybe 4, maybe 5. Too young to articulate fear the way the microcassette did, unless someone older had asked me to describe it. Too young to understand, but old enough to sense tension. A voice, not mine, not my mother's, speaking somewhere in the house. A man's voice, not threatening. Soft, calm. Yet something about it unsettled me. Not because he did anything, but because he wasn't supposed to be there. A visitor? A friend? A relative? No, none of that fit. My mother didn't have friends over. We had no nearby relatives. My father only visited twice after the divorce. I remembered both clearly. This voice wasn't his. So who was he? I fast-forwarded the tape a few minutes, moving through static until the next moment of clarity appeared. This time, the camera angle had changed slightly. The room looked even smaller. The child me huddled closer to the door. My posture was unmistakably fearful, but not because of anything inside the room. I was afraid of what was outside. And suddenly, without warning, I whispered on the recording, "He's talking to you again." The voice was thin, almost trembling, a frightened observation, not an accusation. My stomach tightened. My mother used to talk to someone at night. I didn't know who. I never saw him. I only heard the low murmur of their conversations drifting through walls, one gentle, one strained, one trying to soothe, one trying to hide. Not violent, not harmful, just secret. A secret too heavy for a child to understand. A secret my mother eventually erased from her own memory, or tried to. I paused the tape. I sat very still. Something fragile and complicated unfolded in my mind. Not a revelation, but the approach of one. I leaned closer to the screen, studying the child's posture, the tilt of his head, the way he leaned toward the floor rather than the camera. He wasn't afraid of the dark room. He was listening to the voices downstairs, listening the same way I now listened, to the past pressing against me. I turned off the TV. Silence in the room felt softer now. Not accusatory. Not oppressive. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that waits. I took the microcassette again and rewound it. I played it from the beginning. My child voice breathed shakily into the recorder. "Mom, are you there?" Then a pause. "I heard him last night." "Then you don't remember?" "Then why don't you hear him too?" And finally, "I don't want to sleep alone in the small room." Piece by piece, the fog lifted. The small room wasn't a mystery. It was where my mother put me temporarily because her bedroom was occupied by someone she didn't want me to see, someone who wasn't dangerous, but who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone she later wanted to erase from the story of our lives, because admitting he was there meant admitting she had hidden him from my father, from her family, from the world. And from me. A visitor? No. More than that. Someone she cared for, someone she eventually lost. Not through violence. Not through chaos. Through circumstance. Through endings too complicated to explain to a child. So she moved me into the little room for she left the hallway light on. She soothed me when I felt frightened. She told me I imagined the sounds, and then she erased it all from the narrative, and maybe from her own memory, because it was easier that way. Everything suddenly made sense. The child on the tape wasn't terrified of a supernatural presence. He was confused. He was witnessing emotional complexity. He couldn't process a secret relationship, a person who came into his mother's life quietly and left the same. Someone I overheard but never met. Someone my mother pretended never existed. Wave of emotion rose in my chest, not fear, but a strange tenderness. Sadness. Recognition. I wasn't remembering a haunting. I was remembering a heartbreak that wasn't mine, but that I lived beside. My mother hadn't been protecting me from a person. She had been protecting me from a truth too tangled for a child to hold. And when she couldn't carry it anymore, she hid the tape, hid the memory, hid the evidence of a brief chapter of her life that didn't fit into the story she wanted to leave behind. I closed my eyes, letting this settle. The truth wasn't frightening, but it was human. Flawed. Soft in its own painful way. When I opened my eyes again, I noticed something on the carpet beside me. Something I hadn't seen before, likely because it had slid out of the box earlier. A folded photograph. I picked it up gently and unfolded it. A woman, my mother, standing beside a man I didn't recognize, both smiling, both younger, both looking at each other with a softness that explained everything the tapes couldn't. On the back, in her handwriting, he wanted to meet you, but it was never the right time. My throat tightened. The heaviness in my chest wasn't fear. It was grief for a story I never knew I was part of, for a connection my mother couldn't explain, for a chapter she hid. For a voice I heard as a child, but never saw. The memory door in my mind finally opened, not to darkness, but to understanding. And suddenly, for the first time since arriving in this house, I felt something shift inside me. Not dread. Closure approaching. Quietly. Gently. Like a long locked room being aired out for the first time. But the story wasn't finished yet. There was still one more tape in the box, a fourth, thin slot beneath the padding I hadn't noticed before. One last thing my mother left for me. And whatever it held, it wasn't meant to frighten me. It was meant to explain everything. Asterisk. I didn't open the thin, hidden slot immediately. Instead, I sat with the photograph for a minute longer, letting its weight settle into me. Not the physical weight. It was light, almost fragile, but the emotional one. The man beside my mother wasn't someone I knew, and yet his presence felt strangely familiar, as if I had always known that someone existed in the empty space between truths she told and truths she avoided. I traced their faces with my eyes. My mother looked younger, softer around the edges. The man beside her, calm, warm expression, a certain gentleness in the way he angled his body toward her. They looked right together, not in a dramatic way, but in a quietly natural way. Two people who had found something brief but meaningful, something she couldn't keep, something she couldn't explain to me when I was a child. Something she eventually hid from herself when forgetfulness became her shield rather than her burden. I folded the photo carefully and placed it beside the recorder. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I opened the thin compartment inside the cardboard box. A second microcassette, smaller than the first, labeled only with a letter. My breath steadied. Mother. This was her voice. Not mine. I reached for the recorder, hands steadying themselves instinctively as if they understood the weight of what was coming. The moment I clicked the tape into place, the house felt different. Still quiet, but expectant, like I was finally stepping onto the ground I had been circling around the entire time. I pressed play. Static, soft and thin. Then her voice, older than in my childhood, younger than now, the voice of a woman somewhere in the middle of her life, speaking in a tone she never used with me directly, honest, unguarded, trembling at the edges. If you're listening to this, then I wasn't brave enough to tell you myself. I closed my eyes. Her voice felt like a warm hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry for the room. I'm sorry for the nights you woke afraid. I'm sorry for the door I told you not to open, not because anything dangerous was behind it, but because I didn't know how to explain what you might hear. A pause, a breath. I should have told you years ago. But you were little, and then you weren't little anymore. And somehow the moment never seemed right. The tape clicked faintly as she shifted, maybe adjusting the recorder, maybe gathering her thoughts. You heard him, she continued. Of course you did. Children hear everything. Adults forget that. A soft exhale. His name was Daniel. Daniel, a quiet name, a name with no sharpness, a name that fit the gentle man in the photograph. He wasn't dangerous, she said, as if soothing a worry I never voiced. He never meant to frighten you. He wasn't supposed to stay with us. It was temporary. He had nowhere else to go. She hesitated, and I didn't know how to let him go. The ache in her voice was small but deep, the kind that comes from a memory you loved but weren't allowed to keep. I never told you about him because I didn't want to confuse you or make you think there was something wrong happening in our home. There wasn't. There was just life. Complicated, imperfect life. A faint laugh, tired, self-aware. You were so little. And I swear, I tried to move you back into your room after the first week. But you kept waking in the night. You felt the tension in the house. You sensed that I was torn between caring for you and caring for him. You couldn't understand it, and I couldn't explain it. The light under the door, the voices I couldn't place. The fear that wasn't fear of a person, but fear of being forgotten in the shuffle of adult emotions. It all made sense now. I told him he had to leave, she whispered. Not because I wanted him to, But because you needed me more, and because I knew that someone like him, someone carrying that much sorrow, would eventually leave on his own. Sorrow, that word landed softly. He promised he'd talk to you before he left. He wanted to sit with you, tell you he never meant to frighten you. But you were asleep that night, and sometimes goodbyes are easier that way. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know what you remember. Maybe nothing, maybe too much, maybe something in between. I hoped you would forget. I opened my eyes, staring into the dimness of the living room. The sunlight through the window had shifted. The dust in the beam glowed like slow falling snow. I didn't want the memory of him to hurt you, she said, or confuse you, or make you wonder why he mattered to me. Silence, but he mattered. He mattered very much. I swallowed. Her voice softened even further. I only kept one thing of his. A faint rustle, paper perhaps. If you found this tape, then it's in the box too. I looked into the box. A small envelope lay pressed against the cardboard wall, one I hadn't noticed before. White, sealed, my name written on the front. Her voice continued. It's not a confession, not an apology, just a piece of the truth I never gave you. Another breath. You deserve that truth now. You're old enough to carry it without fear. The tape crackled, and her final words came through quietly, almost fragile. And if you hear a child's voice on the other tape, remember he wasn't afraid of Daniel. He was afraid of losing the version of me that felt whole. Click. End of message. I sat still for a long time. Not none. Simply rooted in the moment, suspended between the man I had been and the man I was becoming through this rediscovery. Nothing supernatural, nothing haunting. Just life. Hidden. Soft. Complicated. I reached into the box and took the envelope. The paper was yellowed slightly at the edges, but the seal intact. I opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a note written in a different handwriting, not my mother's, stronger letters. Clean strokes. I'm sorry I frightened you. You were the most important person in her world. I'm glad you never saw me at my worst. Daniel. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that releases a knot you didn't know was tied. There was no darkness here. No threat. No shadowy figure. Just a man who loved my mother quietly, briefly and perfectly. A child who heard too much. Mother who tried to balance both worlds and ended up burying the pieces of one. I folded the note back into the envelope and held it with both hands. The past wasn't something to fear. It was something to understand. The house felt warmer as I walked upstairs one last time. The small door behind the wardrobe didn't frighten me now. It wasn't a gateway to something unknown. It was simply the door to a room that once held an emotional weight I couldn't process. I slid the wardrobe back into place, not to hide the door, but to let it rest. In the hallway, I paused by my mother's bedroom. Her scent, faint lavender, still lingered. I wondered if she remembered any of this now, in her fading years, whether the truth mattered to her anymore, whether it still ached somewhere inside her or had dissolved into gentler shapes. I decided I wouldn't ask her. Some stories don't need to be revisited out loud. Some truths are for personal closure. And this was mine now. I returned to the living room, gathered the tapes, the photo, the envelope, and placed them neatly inside the box. Not hidden, not buried. Not sealed, just kept. Part of my story now. I sat in front of the TV one last time. The dust and the golden light looked almost peaceful. And quietly, without pressing play, without needing to see anything else, I whispered, "I remember now. And I understand." For the first time that day, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt healed. And so did I. I hadn't reached it yet, but I felt it waiting just beneath the surface of the static.